The burned SUV sat in the middle of the Hartford auction floor, like a piece of scrap. Nobody wanted, starting bid $200, and 72 collectors walked past it without slowing down. Only one man stopped. Ryan Cole, 34, flannel shirt, motor oil still dark under his fingernails. He stared at the wreck for 15 seconds, then raised his hand. The room laughed. They figured the broke mechanic could only afford something already destroyed. 10 days later, the entire classic car world went silent. What did he see that 72 experts missed? The gas station off Albany Avenue had stopped selling gas in 1998. The pumps were still there, rusted to a color that wasn't quite brown anymore. And behind them, in a squat cinder-block building with 2 service bays, Ryan Cole ran what he called a garage, and what the city of Hartford called a code violation. He was 34 years old, and he worked alone. The sign above the door said, Cole Automotive, in letters that had been touched up so many times the paint was thicker than the metal underneath. Inside the bays, 3 cars sat in various stages of resurrection. A 1972 Mustang with no engine, a Camaro on jack stands, a Volvo wagon that belonged to a high school teacher who had been paying him in installments for 4 months and was now 2 payments behind. The mail came every morning around 10, and Ryan didn't open most of it anymore. The envelopes were stacked on the corner of his workbench in a pile that had grown to about 3 inches tall. Weighted down by a torque wrench, red ink showed through some of them. Before Hartford, before the gas station, Ryan had spent 6 years at a restoration shop in a small town outside Coventry in England. He had learned to read a car the way some men read scripture, by the seams, by the welds, by the things the factory tried to hide. The man who trained him, a stooped old craftsman named Edward Whitfield, used to say that a real machine could not lie about what it was. Only people lied. Metal told the truth if you gave it time. He had come back to the States 4 years ago thinking the skill would translate. It hadn't. The high-end collector circuit in Connecticut was a closed room with closed names and a mechanic with grease under his nails, and no buyer's reputation got walked past at every event he tried to attend. He had stopped trying. He stayed in the gas station and worked on whatever rolled through the door, and the work was steady enough to almost cover the bills, which in this part of his life was as close to a victory as he allowed himself to get. On Thursday mornings, a liquidation auction ran out of a former tire warehouse in East Hartford. Most of what came through it was scrap. Fleet vehicles totaled by insurance, repos hauled in from the shoulder of Interstate 91, the occasional boat with a hole in the hull. Ryan went because sometimes parts cars showed up cheap, and he had bought a transmission there once for $40 that he had resold for $300. The return trip was always worth the gas, even when he walked away empty-handed. This was day 1. Tuesday, late October, a gray morning that wanted to rain but couldn't commit. Ryan had cashed a customer's check the day before for an engine swap on a Bronco, $400 in 20s, and he had put $300 of it in his jacket pocket as the entirety of his auction budget. The rest was for gas and groceries. The auction floor was a concrete pad with folding chairs, fluorescent lights buzzing in the rafters, and the smell of brake fluid and stale coffee. The man running it was Frank Doyle, who stood on a milk crate at the front and worked through the lots with the speed of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and had stopped pretending to care about any of it. About 70 bidders were scattered through the room. Some were dealers, some were resellers with junkyard contracts, and a few real collectors in better jackets stood near the back where the lighting was friendlier. Ryan counted them out of habit, 72 by his last sweep. He recognized maybe a dozen faces. None of them recognized him, or if they did, they didn't bother turning their heads to confirm it. Lot 47 came up just before 11. 2 men in coveralls pushed it onto the floor and stepped back. The room went quiet for a second, the kind of quiet that happens when people are trying to figure out what they're looking at, and then somebody in the second row laughed. It was an SUV, or the ghost of one. The paint had been cooked off down to bare metal, and the metal itself had warped in places where the heat had gone past 1,000 degrees. The windows were gone. The wheels were melted into the rims. There was no badge left, no grille, no insignia of any kind that a layman would recognize. The interior was a charred cave. Frank Doyle read from his clipboard in a flat voice. The vehicle had been pulled from a warehouse fire in upstate New York. Title was clean. Records described it as a full-loss body-type SUV manufacturer, unverified, due to fire damage. Starting bid was $200. Nobody moved. The collectors at the back glanced once and looked away. A dealer 2 rows up checked his phone. Doyle waited 4 seconds and started lowering the price. But Ryan had stopped breathing. Something in the proportions was wrong. It wasn't wrong like a damaged car was wrong. It was wrong like a wolf in a kennel of dogs. The wheelbase was too long for the body. The rear quarter sat lower than any production SUV from the last 30 years. The wheel arches, even half-melted, flared in a way that nobody in Detroit or Yokohama had ever stamped onto an assembly line. He had seen that flare before. Once, in a workshop outside Coventry, in a binder of photographs Edward Whitfield kept locked in a desk drawer. Ryan raised his hand. Frank Doyle looked at him, then looked at the price on his clipboard, then back at him. $200 to the gentleman near the back, Doyle said. Anybody else? The room turned. Heads swiveled. A man in a cashmere coat near the back row, Dale Hutchins, who ran a Porsche specialty house out of West Hartford and had been at every auction Ryan had ever attended, laughed out loud and made sure the laugh carried. "Cole," Hutchins called across the floor, "you finally found something in your price range." A few people chuckled. Doyle ignored it. $200 going once, $200 going twice. Sold. Lot 47 to Cole Automotive. Ryan didn't move for a full minute after that. The room moved on to Lot 48, a wrecked Hyundai, and the bidding picked up again. He sat in his folding chair with $200 worth of burned steel registered to his name and a tightness in his chest that he didn't recognize at first. It took him a moment to put a word to it. Fear. Not of losing money. Of being right. He paid in cash at the window. 8 20s and a 10. The clerk slid the title across the counter without looking up. The flatbed driver charged him another $75 to haul the SUV to the gas station, and Ryan counted out the remaining bills from the Bronco job to cover it. By 3 in the afternoon, the wreck was sitting in his rear bay, with the rolling door pulled down behind it. He didn't turn the lights on right away. He walked around it twice in the half-dark hands in his pockets, looking. The shape was easier to read now, away from the noise of the auction floor. The proportions he had seen from across the room were even clearer up close. The greenhouse, what had been the greenhouse before the glass had melted, was shorter than a production SUV by a measurable amount. The roofline dropped 2 inches faster than it should have. The rear hatch had a recessed seam that no factory stamping would have produced. Hand-formed, almost certainly hand-formed. He turned on the overhead lights and got the floor jack. For the next 6 hours, Ryan worked with the methodical patience of someone trying not to hope. He raised the front end. He crawled underneath with a wire brush and a flashlight, peeling carbon off the chassis rails in small flakes. The metal underneath came up clean in some places and pitted in others. He brushed and looked and brushed again. He didn't eat. He didn't check the time. The Volvo wagon in the front bay creaked the way old steel did when the temperature dropped at night, and the only sound in the building besides that was the soft scratch of the brush against carbon. At 8:40 in the evening, on the inside of the driver's side frame rail about a foot back from the front suspension mount, he found what he had been looking for. A stamping, 11 digits. The first 3 were a manufacturer code he had only ever seen in photographs. His hand stopped moving. He went up to the workbench and pulled a binder from the bottom drawer. It was old. The spine cracked the pages soft from years of being opened and closed. Whitfield had given it to him the week before he left England. A reference. A favor for a student the old man thought had promise. He flipped to the section he wanted. He read it twice to be sure. The manufacturer code on the chassis matched a stamping used between 1998 and 2001 by a small experimental division inside a European performance house that had since been folded into a larger group. The division had been working on a high-performance SUV, a homologation project, intended for a desert rally series that ultimately got canceled before it ever ran. 11 prototypes had been built. 8 had been tested in the field. 3 had been kept in storage at a private facility in the south of France. In 2003, that facility had burned to the ground. The official record listed all 8 tested prototypes as destroyed in the fire. The 3 storage units were never publicly accounted for. The project had been quietly shelved, written off and forgotten. Ryan looked from the binder to the SUV in his bay, then back to the binder, then back to the SUV. If he was reading the stamping right, and he was reading the stamping right, what was sitting in his rear bay was one of the 8 tested prototypes that had supposedly been destroyed in 2003, which meant the burning at the warehouse in upstate New York hadn't been the first fire this car had survived. It had been the second. The car had spent more than 20 years moving through hands that didn't know what they were holding, and now it had landed in his. He sat on the concrete floor for a long time. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. He understood sitting there what the math meant. A verified surviving prototype from that division, even fire-damaged, even partially destroyed, would not be a $200 curiosity. The last authenticated piece from the same project, a development engine block that had surfaced at a private sale in 2017, had moved for $1.1 million by itself. A complete chassis, even compromised, would be a fundamentally different conversation. The kind of conversation that didn't happen in Hartford. The kind that happened in Monaco and London, in private boardrooms with lawyers in the room. 2 paths opened in front of him. He could keep the find quiet, verify it himself over weeks, do the documentation alone, sell it through a private channel where the noise stayed low and the buyers stayed civilized. Or he could authenticate it openly, the way the trade required, and put himself directly in front of every collector and every auction house and every lawyer that would suddenly want a piece of what he had just bought for $200. The quiet path was safer. He knew that. He also knew, sitting on that concrete floor with the binder open on his lap, that the quiet path required him to be a different kind of man than he was. A man who could lie about provenance for the rest of the car's life. A man who could let the history disappear into a private collection in Dubai or Monaco and never come back out. He thought about Edward Whitfield, about the binder, about the old craftsman saying that metal told the truth if you gave it time. The car had survived 2 fires and 20 years of being ignored. It deserved better than another quiet grave. Ryan closed the binder. He stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked over to the SUV. He put his palm flat against the warped sheet metal of the hood. It was cold. The carbon left a black mark on his skin. "Okay," he said to no one in particular, and the words sounded smaller in the empty bay than he had expected. He turned off the overhead lights, locked the rolling door, and went upstairs to the small apartment above the office. He didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and started writing down everything he knew. Every detail, every measurement, every reason he was right. Outside on Albany Avenue, the wind moved through the dead gas pumps and made a low whistle that had been the soundtrack of his life for 4 years. By morning, he had a plan. He would document the find himself for the next 24 hours, and then he would reach out to Whitfield in England for a second opinion quietly before he spoke to anyone in the American trade. That was the cleanest version. That was the version that gave him the most time and the most control. What he hadn't accounted for was the photograph. He had taken 3 pictures of the chassis, stamping at 9:15 the night before for his own records, and he had sent one of them to a former colleague in Coventry, whose discretion he trusted. The colleague was discreet. The colleague's nephew, who happened to look at the colleague's phone over coffee the next morning, was not. By the time Ryan finished his second cup of coffee on day 2, the photograph was already moving through channels he hadn't intended. Within 48 hours, it would be in front of 3 of the most aggressive collectors in Europe, 2 American auction houses, and 1 man in West Hartford named Dale Hutchins, who would not be laughing the next time he said Ryan's name. Day 3 was about to begin, and the burned SUV in the rear bay of a dead gas station off Albany Avenue was about to stop being his secret. Day 3 started with a phone call from a number Ryan didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. By noon, he had received 9 more, each from a different area code, and the voicemail box was full. He cleared it, listened to 2 of the messages, and stopped. The first was from a broker in London who wanted to introduce himself. The second was from a man in Geneva who described himself as an associate of an unnamed principal and used the phrase preemptive private offer twice in 30 seconds. He turned the phone off and went down to the bay. The SUV was where he had left it, jacked up at the front, the chassis stamping still exposed under the floodlight he had clamped to a rolling cart. He had done nothing to the body since Tuesday night. He didn't intend to. Anything he removed now would compromise the authentication when the time came. And he had been in the trade long enough to know that the only thing more dangerous than not understanding a discovery was overworking it before the right people had seen it. At 2:30 in the afternoon, a black town car pulled into the lot. A man in his 60s stepped out wearing a navy overcoat that did not belong on Albany Avenue. He introduced himself as a representative of a private collection based in Zurich and presented a business card that listed no firm and no title. He had heard, he said carefully, that Ryan might be in possession of an item of unusual interest. He was authorized to discuss a number in the high 6 figures today in cash. No questions about origin, no paperwork beyond a bill of sale. Ryan asked him how he had heard. The man smiled, the way diplomats smiled, and said the trade was a small village. Ryan told him the vehicle was not for sale. The man nodded, said he understood, said he would leave his card, and that the offer would remain open for 48 hours, after which his principal might be forced to consider other approaches. The phrase other approaches sat in the air for a moment. Ryan walked him back to the town car without responding. The driver had been idling the engine the entire time. That night, Ryan slept for the first time since Monday. 4 hours fully clothed on the couch in the office. He woke before sunrise, with his neck stiff and the binder still open on the floor, where it had slid out of his lap. He made coffee in the bay because the kitchenette upstairs felt too far away. The certified letter arrived on day 4. It came from a law firm in Boston that represented the East Hartford liquidation auction. The language was polite, professional, and unmistakable. The firm had been retained to examine, quote, certain irregularities in the description of Lot 47 from the Tuesday sale, and to determine whether the buyer had, quote, exploited material information not available to the seller at the time of the auction. They requested a meeting within 7 business days. The signature at the bottom was a senior partner with a name Ryan recognized from the financial pages. Howard Briggs called personally an hour after the letter arrived. Briggs ran the East Hartford liquidation operation, and Ryan had seen him at the back of the room every Thursday for 2 years, without ever exchanging a word. Briggs was friendly on the phone. He wanted to clear up a misunderstanding. He wanted Ryan to know that his firm was not, quote, looking to make things difficult, but that, under the circumstances, a conversation about, quote, an equitable resolution would benefit both parties. Ryan said he would have his attorney respond. He didn't have an attorney. He hung up and stared at the phone until the screen went dark. By day 4 evening, the photograph that had leaked through Coventry had reached Reddit. The thread was on a niche subforum dedicated to lost prototype vehicles, and the original post had 211 comments by midnight. The image showed only the chassis stamping and a portion of the burned floor pan, but a user with the handle Project Delta had matched the manufacturer code to a database entry within the first hour. By morning, the post had been screenshot to a private Discord server populated by exactly the kind of people Ryan had been hoping not to deal with for at least another week. The first reporter showed up on day 5, a woman from a Connecticut automotive blog who had been tipped off by someone in the auction house. She knocked on the bay door at 9 in the morning with a recorder already running. Ryan told her politely that he had no comment. She left a card and said she would be back. By 10, 2 more vehicles had parked across the street, one of them, with a long lens visible on the dashboard. Ryan went inside, pulled the curtains down over the office window for the first time since he had taken over the building, and called the only number he had been waiting to call since Tuesday. Edward Whitfield answered on the 4th ring. The line was clear, despite the ocean between them. The old man had already seen the photograph. He had been sent the image by a former apprentice in Stuttgart on Wednesday, and had recognized the stamping before he had finished his tea. He asked Ryan 2 questions. The first was whether anyone else had been inside the bay. The second was whether the chassis numbers were intact along the entire rail or only at the suspension mount. Ryan answered both. Whitfield said he would book a flight that afternoon. He arrived at Bradley International just after 11 that night. Ryan met him at arrivals. Whitfield was 71 and walked with a slight stoop that he had acquired sometime in the 4 years since Ryan had last seen him, but the eyes were the same. He carried a single leather case that contained, Ryan knew, the only tools he ever traveled with. They drove the 20 miles back to Hartford in near silence. Whitfield asked once whether the building had decent lighting. Ryan said it did. Whitfield nodded and looked out the window at the sodium glow of the highway. Inside the bay, the old man took off his coat and went to work. He walked the perimeter twice with a small flashlight, ran a gloved finger along the recessed seam of the rear hatch, and then lowered himself onto a creeper and slid underneath. Ryan stood by the workbench and waited. The clock on the wall read 11:47. By 12:30, Whitfield had been under the car for 40 minutes without speaking. When he came out, he sat up slowly on the creeper and looked at Ryan for a long moment before he said anything. "It's chassis 6, he said. "One of the 8 tested units. The stamping is consistent with the 2001 production run, and the hand-formed sections at the rear quarter match the photographs I have in Coventry. The body is genuine. It survived the fire in 2003. Someone hit it well, and whoever hit it didn't know what they had. Because if they had, this car would never have ended up in a warehouse in upstate New York." The 2 of them slept for 4 hours each on cots in the office and started again at 7 in the morning. Day 6 was the working day. Whitfield documented every measurement, every weld, every hand-formed seam. He took photographs with a small Leica he had brought from England. He removed the access panel under the rear seat himself, with Ryan handing him tools, and confirmed that the original development drivetrain was still in place, the casting marks intact. He worked through the morning, broke for an hour at noon to eat a sandwich and write notes, and worked through the afternoon. By 6 in the evening, he had filled 40 pages of a small black notebook with measurements and observations. He told Ryan over coffee that what he was looking at was, by his estimate, the most significant surviving prototype in the European performance segment. From the period. He did not put a number on it. He did not need to. That night, Ryan understood that the conversation he had imagined with Monaco buyers in private boardrooms was no longer the conversation he was going to have. The conversation was going to be louder than that. Much louder. Whitfield flew back to England on the morning of day 7. Before he left, he agreed to issue a formal preliminary authentication letter through his own consultancy. The letter would carry weight in the trade. It would also, both men understood, end any chance of Ryan controlling the news cycle on his own terms. By day 7 afternoon, the story had moved past the niche forums and into the mainstream press. A motoring journalist in London ran a column under the headline, "The Ghost of Provence Resurfaces in Connecticut." The piece was speculative, careful, and unmistakably accurate about the manufacturer and the project. Within 12 hours, the story had been picked up by automotive trades in Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Hartford Courant ran a local angle the following morning. The phone in the gas station office, which Ryan had unplugged on day 5, was reconnected by a process server who needed to confirm the address. Ryan plugged it back in only long enough to receive the subpoena, then unplugged it again. The collectors started arriving in person on the evening of day 7. 3 black cars in a single hour. 2 of them were brokers. The third belonged to a man who introduced himself simply as Marcus Delaney and asked very politely whether he could come inside. Ryan had heard the name. Anyone who had worked in the high-end restoration trade for more than a year had heard the name. Delaney owned a private collection of 52 vehicles housed in a climate-controlled facility in Greenwich, and he was by reputation the most aggressive buyer in the Northeast. Ryan let him in. Delaney was in his late 50s, lean gray, dressed in the kind of casual clothes that cost more than the Volvo wagon in the front bay. He looked at the SUV for a full minute without speaking, then turned to Ryan and said, $2 million. Today. Wire transfer in the next 90 minutes. No conditions on your end. You walk away clean. Ryan asked him why. Delaney smiled slightly. Because in 3 weeks, it will be worth 4. In 6 months, it will be worth 8. And I can wait. You cannot. He looked around the bay at the stack of envelopes on the workbench, at the Volvo on jack stands. I know what your overhead is, Mr. Cole. I know what your debts are. I am not your enemy. I am offering you the cleanest exit you will be offered in this entire process. The longer you wait, the more people will be in the room. And the more people are in the room, the less control you have over what happens to that vehicle. Ooh, Ryan thanked him and told him the car was not for sale. Delaney did not argue. He produced a card, set it on the workbench, and said, "When you are ready, the number on this card answers 24 hours a day. The offer will not stay at $2 million. It will go up for the next 48 hours, and then it will start going down. I would think carefully about which side of that curve you want to be standing on." He let himself out. The town car pulled away with the same quiet that had announced its arrival. That night, Ryan sat in the bay alone with the door rolled down. The pressure had a physical weight to it now. He hadn't shaved in 4 days. His back hurt from the cot. He had a bruise on his forearm from a tool he didn't remember bumping into. Delaney had been the most honest of his visitors in his way. He had at least named the trade. $2 million in exchange for the rest of the story. The auction house attorneys called again on day 8. They had moved from polite to direct. The position now conveyed by Howard Briggs himself through speakerphone with 3 lawyers audible in the background was that the description of Lot 47 had been, quote, materially incomplete, and that the firm was prepared to seek rescission of the sale through litigation if a private settlement could not be reached. Briggs offered generously in his own description to refund the $200 and pay Ryan a quote recognition fee of $50,000 in exchange for return of the vehicle. Ryan told him to put it in writing and hung up. The media presence on Albany Avenue became continuous after day 8. 3 news vans by morning, 6 by afternoon. A neighbor across the street called the city about the obstruction, and a Hartford police officer came by to make sure nothing was being violated. The officer was sympathetic. He took a coffee from the office and told Ryan that whatever was going on, he hoped it ended well. Ryan thanked him and watched him leave. What Ryan understood sitting at his workbench on the evening of day 8 with the phone still unplugged and the bay door still rolled down was that nobody who had walked into the building in the last 6 days had asked him a single question about the car itself. Not one of them had asked about the chassis numbers. Not one had asked what the hand-formed seams told him about the build process. Not Delaney. Not the man from Zurich. Not the brokers. Not the lawyers. They had all asked about money, and about timelines, and about exclusivity, and about wire transfers. The car itself, the actual object that had survived 2 fires and 20 years of being ignored, was not the subject of any of their conversations. It was a unit of value to them. Nothing more. Whitfield's preliminary authentication letter was published on day 9. The consultancy released it through its usual channels in London at 9 in the morning, local time 4 in the morning Eastern. By the time Ryan woke up, the letter had been quoted in 17 articles across 4 continents. The headline number floating through the coverage was $8 million. 2 of the British trades suggested that figure was conservative, Marcus Delaney called personally at 6:58 that morning. The offer was no longer $2 million, it was $4. Cash immediate. His jet was on the runway at Westchester County. He could be in Hartford with a banker by 11. Ryan walked through the front office of the gas station with the phone still in his hand. He looked at the workbench. He looked at the stack of envelopes weighted down by the torque wrench. He looked at the office window where the curtain had been pulled for 4 days. Through a gap in the fabric, he could see 2 news vans on the far side of Albany Avenue, and a man with a long lens leaning against the hood of a sedan. The dead gas pumps stood between the building and the street like rusted witnesses. He understood standing in that office that the life he had walked into on Tuesday morning was already gone. It didn't matter what he decided about the car. It didn't matter whether he took Delaney's $4 million or held out for 8 or 12 or 20. The mechanic who had paid $200 in cash at the window of an East Hartford warehouse and driven home with a flatbed behind him, the man who had counted 72 bidders out of habit and recognized none of them, did not exist anymore. The phone calls would not stop. The cars in the lot would not stop. The lawyers would not stop. Even if he sold the car tomorrow and refused to speak about it for the rest of his life, he would never again walk into a Thursday auction without being the man who had bought the burned prototype. The anonymity that had been the floor of his existence for 4 years was gone, and it was not coming back. He set the phone down on the workbench without returning Delaney's call. The choice in front of him was no longer about price. It was about what kind of ending the car got and what kind of ending he gave himself in the process. $2 million, $4 million, $8 million, $20 million. The numbers were variations on the same outcome if the car ended up in a Greenwich vault or a Monaco garage. The story would die there. The history would die there. And the man who had spent $200 to drag it out of an auction floor in Hartford would die there too, in the only way that mattered. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had been writing in the margin of his notebook for 2 days without dialing. The voice that answered was a woman with a calm, professional Arizona accent. He told her his name. He told her what he had. He asked her how soon she could send someone to look at it. Catherine Reeves landed at Bradley International on the morning of day 10. She had been on the museum's acquisitions committee for 19 years, and she had been awake since the previous afternoon, working through Whitfield's published authentication and the museum's internal valuation models during the flight from Phoenix. She was in her early 50s, gray blonde hair pulled back, a canvas field bag over one shoulder that she had carried into engine bays and museum vaults on 3 continents. The Arizona museum she represented was not the largest in the country, but it was the one that serious collectors trusted, and Ryan had known the name for as long as he had been in the trade. He met her at the curb outside arrivals at 10:20 in the morning, and they drove back to Hartford without small talk. Inside the bay, she set the field bag on the workbench and pulled out a folder before she looked at the car. The folder contained printouts of Whitfield's letter, a list of 9 specific verification points the museum's restoration team had flagged, and a single page of questions she wanted to ask Ryan after the inspection. She walked to the SUV with the folder open in one hand and a pen tucked behind her ear. She started at the chassis, stamping. She matched it against a magnified reference photograph the museum had pulled from a private archive in Munich the night before. She moved to the rear hatch and ran the pen tip lightly along the recessed seam, comparing it to a measurement Whitfield had published. She climbed a small step stool Ryan brought her without being asked, and she looked at the warped roofline from above. She asked him 3 questions in the first hour, each of them about the car itself, what condition the welds at the rear axle had been in when he found it, whether the development drivetrain access panel had been previously removed, and whether he had documented the floor plan before Whitfield arrived. Ryan answered each question precisely. She wrote his answers down on the page of questions and moved to the next point. After 90 minutes, she closed the folder. "I read the Whitfield letter on the plane," she said. "I came here to verify it. I am verifying it. The car is what he says it is. I want to make you an offer." She set the folder back on the workbench. $10 million, wired to your bank within 72 hours of signing. The museum takes possession of the vehicle in its current condition and undertakes the conservation work in-house under our own restoration team. The car becomes part of the permanent collection. Ryan had been preparing for the number for 30 hours. He had been preparing for what came after the number for longer than that. He thanked her, stepped to the workbench, and pulled a single sheet of paper from the drawer where he kept his service invoices. The sheet had 4 handwritten lines on it. He had written them at 4 in the morning and rewritten them at 7, and the version he handed her now was the 3rd draft. "One condition," he said. "Before you wire anything, the full story of this car gets displayed with it. The fire in 2003, the years between then and now, the auction in East Hartford, the $200, the 72 bidders who walked past it, Whitfield's authentication, all of it. Public, permanent, part of the exhibit, not a plaque with a price tag. The actual story." Catherine Reeves read the 4 lines. She read them again. She looked at him with a kind of professional curiosity he had not received from anyone in 9 days. "Why?" she said. Ryan looked at the SUV. The carbon was still on the metal. The fluorescent lights still buzzed in the rafters. The Volvo wagon was still on jack stands in the front bay, 4 payments behind now. "Because the only reason this car still exists," he said, "is that it survived being treated like it was worthless. Twice. If you put it behind glass with a price tag, you make it about the price tag. You make it about me. You make it about the auction. You don't make it about the car. The point of finding it isn't the money. The point is that it was findable. That somebody could still look at a thing and see what was actually there." His voice was quiet. He had not raised it once in 9 days. Not at Delaney, not at the lawyers, not at the brokers. He did not raise it now. "If the museum can't tell the story honestly, I'll find a museum that can. There are 3 others I can call this afternoon." Catherine Reeves folded the sheet of paper in half and put it in her folder. "I'll need to clear it with the board," she said. "I can have an answer in 4 hours. The answer came in 2. The board had been waiting for her call since the night before. The museum agreed to the condition in writing, with the additional commitment that the exhibit text would be developed in consultation with Ryan and with Edward Whitfield, and that no element of the story would be edited for marketing purposes without his approval. The contract was drafted by the museum's counsel that afternoon and emailed to a Hartford attorney whose name Ryan had finally written down on the back of an envelope at noon. They met at the attorney's office on Asylum Avenue at 4:30. Catherine Reeves signed first. Ryan signed at 4:47 in the afternoon on day 10. The wire transfer initiated the following Monday. $10 million minus taxes and fees settled in an account at the small commercial bank where Ryan had kept the same checking account for 4 years. The teller who processed the deposit confirmation was the same woman who had cashed his customer's check the morning before the auction. She looked at the number on her screen for a full second longer than she needed to before she looked back up at him. She did not say anything. He did not either. He thanked her and walked out into the parking lot, and he sat in the truck for several minutes before he turned the key. The story moved quickly in the trade press after the signing. Whitfield's authentication had been the first wave. The museum acquisition was the second. The third was the disclosure 3 weeks later that the East Hartford liquidation auction had quietly closed its operation pending what the firm's statement described as a, quote, comprehensive internal review of intake and description procedures. The same statement noted the retirement of Howard Briggs effective immediately. There was no mention of Lot 47. The lawsuit the auction house had threatened was withdrawn without explanation. The attorney who had signed the original certified letter never returned Ryan's counsel's calls. Ryan understood when the dismissal arrived that the firm had finally calculated what discovery would look like in front of a judge. Every email about Lot 47, every photograph the consignor had submitted, every shortcut the description had taken. The risk of losing the case was real, the risk of winning it, and being seen to have tried to take a verified prototype away from the man who had identified it was worse. Marcus Delaney sent one final message on the morning of day 11 before the wire had even cleared. It was a handwritten note delivered by courier. The note congratulated Ryan in 3 lines on what Delaney described as a, quote, principled exit. The note suggested that should Ryan ever consider entering the private side of the trade, Delaney would consider it a courtesy to take his call. There was no business card this time. The note was signed only with initials. Ryan put it in the drawer with the service invoices and did not respond. He understood that this was Delaney's version of respect, and he understood that he did not owe Delaney anything beyond receiving it. Dale Hutchins did not call. Ryan did not expect him to. The man from West Hartford, who had laughed across the auction floor on day 1, had been quoted briefly in the Hartford Courant follow-up piece, claiming he had, quote, recognized something unusual about the vehicle, but had been outbid before he could act. The quote ran on a Wednesday. By Friday, 3 commenters on a regional collector forum had pointed out that Hutchins had been audibly recorded laughing at Ryan during the bid and had never raised a hand. Hutchins did not comment on those threads. He did not comment on the story again. The next time Ryan saw him 6 months later at a charity event in Farmington that Ryan attended at the museum's invitation, Hutchins crossed the room in the opposite direction before they could meet. The first thing Ryan did with the money was pay the envelopes on the workbench. He went through them in order from the oldest at the bottom to the most recent at the top, and he wrote checks against each of them. Utilities, property tax on the gas station building, a loan from a credit union in West Hartford that had been carrying him for 2 years, the supplier accounts at 3 different parts warehouses. The Volvo wagon in the front bay went back to its owner, with the work completed and a refund check for the installments she had already paid, which Ryan delivered in person and which the teacher accepted with both hands and tears that she did not try to hide. He bought the gas station building outright from the landlord in the 2nd week. He had been renting it for 4 years on a month-to-month arrangement that had always felt one bad winter away from ending. The owner accepted a cash offer that was generous but not extravagant, and the deed transferred before Thanksgiving. Ryan kept the sign over the door. He had the letters repainted by a local sign shop in the same color they had always been, by a man who refused to charge him for the work. The expansion took longer. He kept the original 2 bays at the gas station and added 3 more in a new building on the lot behind it. The new building had proper lighting, a sealed concrete floor, a climate-controlled side room for delicate work, and a small office with a window that looked back at the dead pumps out front. He kept the pumps. The city had offered to remove them as part of a redevelopment incentive. He declined. They were part of the building. The training fund was set up in the 3rd month with help from a foundation lawyer the museum had recommended. The structure was simple. Young mechanics from the Hartford area, under 25 with documented financial need and no formal trade school access, could apply for a 1-year apprenticeship at Cole Automotive that included a stipend, tools, and certification fees. The first cohort was 3 apprentices. By the end of the 2nd year, it would be 8, and Ryan would have hired 2 of the graduates onto his permanent staff. The fund's only formal requirement was that the apprentices learn how to read a car, not how to fix one, how to read one. The distinction was in the program literature, and it was not explained further. The apprentices figured it out within the 1st month. The SUV went on display in Arizona the following spring. The conservation work took 5 months. The museum did not paint over the carbon. It did not restore the warped panels. It cleaned the chassis, stabilized the corrosion, and preserved the body in the condition it had arrived. The exhibit was installed in a dedicated room. The text on the walls was developed exactly as the contract had specified in consultation with Ryan and with Edward Whitfield, and it ran along 3 sides of the gallery in plain, unembellished language. The fire in 2003. The 20 years of unaccounted custody. The warehouse in upstate New York. The Tuesday morning in East Hartford. The $200. the 72 bidders, the 15-second look, the chassis stamping, the phone call to Coventry, the flight from England, the $10 million, and what it had been spent on afterward. Ryan flew out for the opening. He had not been on a plane in 6 years. Catherine Reeves met him at the airport and drove him to the museum, and they walked through the exhibit together before it was open to the public. He stood in front of the SUV under the gallery lighting for a long time. The carbon on the hood was still where his palm had been on day 2. The warped metal of the rear quarter still flared the way it had flared on the auction floor. He read the text on the walls twice. He thanked her. He did not say anything else. She did not need him to. He flew back to Hartford the next day. He did not give interviews at the opening. The museum's communication staff handled the press. The story ran in 3 major outlets that weekend, and the photographs that accompanied the coverage were of the car and the exhibit text. Ryan's name appeared in the captions, but not in the headlines. That was the way the contract had been written. It was the way he had asked for it. The garage settled into a rhythm by the 2nd year. The apprentices came and went. The Mustang in the front bay was finished and sold to a collector in New Hampshire for a fair price. New work came in, more of it now. Some of it the kind of high-end restoration jobs that had been closed to Ryan before. He took the ones he wanted. He turned down the ones he didn't. He went to the East Hartford auction once in the 2nd autumn after the sale to see what had replaced the firm that had retired. The new operation was cleaner, the descriptions more careful, the floor better lit. He did not bid on anything. He sat in the back and watched, and the room watched him back. And after an hour he stood up and left. The night Ryan would remember longest came 2 years after the sale on an October evening when the building was empty and the new apprentices had gone home, and the original bay, the rear bay where the SUV had sat for 10 days, was being used for storage. He walked into it after closing alone and stood in the empty space where the burned chassis had once been. The floor was clean. The clamp light he had used on the first night was still on its rolling cart in the corner. The binder Whitfield had given him in England was on a shelf above the workbench where he kept it now. He thought about the auction floor. He thought about the moment Frank Doyle had read the description in a flat voice and the room had laughed and looked away. He thought about the 72 bidders who had walked past the car without slowing down. He thought about Dale Hutchins laughing across the room and about Marcus Delaney's quiet town car and about Howard Briggs on the speakerphone with 3 lawyers in the background. He thought about Whitfield under the car at midnight with a flashlight. He thought about Catherine Reeves with her folder open and her pen behind her ear. What he understood standing in the empty bay was that the world had not failed to see the car because it was hidden. The car had not been hidden. It had been sitting in the middle of an auction floor under fluorescent lights in front of 72 people who were paid to look at cars. The world had failed to see the car because the world had decided in advance what it was looking at, and the deciding had taken less time than the looking. $200. Burned. Worthless. Next lot. The real value had been there the entire time. Not buried, not hidden, just covered in carbon. And the only thing that had separated him from the 72 other people in that room was that he had been willing to look for 15 seconds longer than they had. He turned off the lights, locked the rolling door, and walked back across the lot to the new building. The dead pumps stood between him and Albany Avenue, rusted useless, still there. Above them, the sign with the repainted letters caught the street light at an angle and held it for a moment before he passed underneath it and went inside.